everyone, I'm Dr. Catherine Flick. I'm from De Montfort University in the UK, but as you can probably tell from my slightly Englishified accent, I'm originally from Sydney, and I did my undergraduate at UCID, and then I did my PhD at Charles Sturt University. Yeah, so I'm really excited to be able to participate in this conference. Thanks so much for inviting me. The talk I'd like to give today is about co-creating ethical technology futures with diverse voices. So the project that I'm working on at the moment is called the Living Innovation Project. It's got 14 partners across Europe, including some big names like Atos, Telefonica, Ericsson, Infineon. There's probably a few there that you've recognized. There's probably a few that you don't. But most of these are large companies that are involved in developing smart health and smart home technologies. The idea of the project before COVID hit was to have a series of 19 co-creation workshops across Europe. Most of these driven by the companies themselves, where they get people in. Citizens is the European term for this sort of activity. They get citizens in to discuss and co-create technology, basically technologies of the future. It's a really nice, diverse approach to kind of this sort of question of how do you co-create the future of technology when, you know, most of the people in companies tend to be young, they tend to be male, they tend to be white, in Europe in particular, and they don't necessarily have the experiences or know what the requirements are, or the needs or the problems that other people that aren't like them have. So the overall aim is to co-create the way we will live in 2030, and there's a whole load of ongoing activities that this project has. It's got a big platform where people who are interested can sign up, and I'll give some links at the end if you're interested in having a look at it. But one of the particular focus, as I said, was how citizens can be involved in developing these sorts of innovations, and also we want to show big companies in particular the benefits of user-led responsible innovation. We're responsible for a series of workshops called High Tech at Home. So, Leicester, which is where I live at the moment, is an extremely deprived city. It's a city of about 400,000 residents, about the size of Canberra, roughly, but in a much smaller space. Most of the housing here, traditionally it's a manufacturing city, particularly manufacturing hosiery. And so it's traditionally a lot of Victorian terraces where you get like quite a few people in a room. I'm speaking to you now from a 1930s semi-detached house, which is the other classic kind of house. So two houses kind of stuck together. But yeah, it's a different sort of approach to cramming as many people into a place as you can. So Leicester itself has had a lot of immigration. It's one of the most diverse cities in the UK after London. It's got a huge range of different cultures, different backgrounds, different ethnicities. There's a street called Narborough Road, which has, I think they worked out there were shops run by people from over 80 different countries. So it's a really, really diverse area. And it's really, I think Leicester is one of those cities where multiculturalism has actually worked really well. And like with any big city in the UK, there are going to be patterns of deprivation. So as you can see in this picture here, the red parts are the parts of the city that are the most deprived. So what they talk about most deprived, it's most deprived in the whole UK, not just within the city. So 1 in 4 Leicester residents live in the 10% most deprived part of England. 1 in 4 children live in areas of high income deprivation, and 1 in 3 people live in areas of high education deprivation. And so it's actually like there's a lot of support, a lot of things being put in place to help these people as much as they can, given the fact that we have had a very conservative government the last 10 plus years. And we've had massive austerity programs post the crash. And now we've got COVID and Brexit on the horizon. It's not looking like it's necessarily going to get much better, but they're really doing a lot with not very much, and trying to support as many people in the city as possible. So at De Montfort University, we have a DMU local campaign where we get students and staff involved in doing things like helping with education, helping with like food banks and things like that. helping to run events in local areas that, you know, people might not necessarily be able to come into the city for. We were partnering with DMU Local to do these workshops that we were going to do. And what we were going to originally do was actually go into each of these communities, so some of these most deprived areas, and we were going to run the workshops there. And we had plans of doing these like huge life-sized artwork. We have an artist on board who runs art workshops in these areas, and we were going to run these massive art workshops, which would have like full-scale recreations of rooms and houses and all this sort of really cool stuff. So it would be a whole day workshop. We'd get families in to work together on a weekend, and we'd do all this sort of thing together. However, COVID then hit. So before I get into what COVID meant that we ended up doing, I want to talk about why we were particularly interested in these groups. Why were we interested in going into these most deprived parts of Leicester? European research projects are very white, they're very middle class, and they're very male. And the European Research Council has noticed this, and they've put a few things in recently to really try to encourage research in Europe to become less white, middle class and male, but mostly they've been working on trying to build up the gender equality, which while, you know, that's fine, it has turned into a bit of a checkbox exercise. So a lot of European research projects will go, oh, well, we've got some women, so that checks the equality and diversity box. So while they may have sorted some of the gender equality problems out, the other intersections have not been so well dealt with. So they're still overwhelmingly white, they're still overwhelmingly middle class, and this then translates into the sorts of people that are recruited to do things like focus groups or do user input or user-led design or co-creation or any of these sorts of activities. It just means that people tend to work with their own networks, and their own networks tend to be like themselves. So despite the fact that responsible research and innovation calls for public engagement and defines public engagement as implying a two-way, iterative, inclusive and participatory process of multi-actor exchanges and dialogues, also involving minorities, considering gender and multiple generations. So really, most projects have managed to avoid this, and they've managed to get away with saying, well, we have mostly gender parity, so we're okay. And particularly EU responsible research and innovation projects, which should know better, have still been focusing on these, like, basically just getting away with the bare minimum. And mostly that's because I'd say there's probably, to a certain degree, it's the fact that academia is still highly white and middle class in Europe, and there's a whole load of kind of pipeline problems that need to be fixed here. But in terms of things like recruiting citizens, there's no excuse, right? European projects really should be getting, especially ones who are supposed to be doing ethics research and showing a good example to other research projects, should be doing this better. So that's why we wanted to focus on this group of people. And we wanted to show that it can be done. We wanted to show that it is fruitful and successful. And we wanted to show particularly big companies that it actually gives them something that they can work with. And it's not a waste of time. It's not just reiterating old things that they already know, for example. So what we ended up doing post-COVID, instead of going and doing these really cool workshops, we ended up... we wanted to get our unusual suspects, because there's a bit of a joke within European research communities that you end up with the usual suspects. They call them professional citizens. And it's really just the same group of citizens that become very good at being representative citizens that get invited to all of these projects. So we wanted to have these unusual suspects. We wanted real people who had never been involved in research, not necessarily never been involved in research, but certainly were not on part of our usual networks, ones that we would have to work really hard to find. So we partnered up with DMU Local, our local outreach that does all those educational things and art workshops and stuff like that. We recruited 14 families, well actually 12 families plus 2 pilot families, and we set them up a task of doing 3 online asynchronous workshops with a follow-up interview at the end. And the idea was to do a kind of a design thinking style approach where we would ask the families to come up with a problem and draw their problem or illustrate their problem. We would then switch with another family, and the families would then create a solution to the other family's problem, and then they would get their solution back from the other family, and they would modify it or find an alternative, or look at the feasibility of it, that sort of thing, and come up with a final solution. So we had some videos done by John Joe Elliott, our artist, who was really brilliant. We had our ethics approval. Obviously, when you're working with children, they're particularly vulnerable. We had a very, very complex metadata approach to keeping, because obviously we had to keep track of where all our pictures were and what all our families were doing, but it worked out quite well. So we ended up with 3 weeks of these workshops where we just email out an instruction set. We'd remind them to send in a picture, then we'd swap them around and follow the process as you can see here. And yeah, it's a sort of a light design thinking kind of approach. And this is the way we could keep the co-creation despite the fact that we had COVID. We had essentially, because we were unable to get them to work together in teams like we would have done in a face-to-face workshop, so we were getting them to kind of co-create with each other virtually in kind of a asynchronous way. So we had 12 families that took part, with at least one adult and one child above 6 years old. Most of our families had multiple adults, and most of them had multiple children. Half of them, so we had to open up our recruitment to anyone in Leicester, because we wanted to make sure that we had as broad a net as possible. And a lot of the people who participated, they really only had mobile phone internet. So it was actually quite an interesting engagement activity to do things like the follow-up interviews via Zoom, where they'd all kind of crowd around a phone. But it really shows that, it shows that the accessibility of broadband, for example, in some parts of Leicester, and perhaps not great, or that mobile phone technology is just that good now, and we actually have fairly fast speeds in terms of broadband, and it's very cheap here compared with Australia, certainly. All of our families completed all 3 workshops, which was absolutely gobsmacking, because normally when you do a series of workshops where you're asking people to follow up week after week after week, you lose at least half of them. And so we were really, we were wanting to get 20 families so that we would get 10 by the end. But we ended up only getting 12 families, but we ended up with 12 at the end. And that was just brilliant. I was really, really pleased with how that went. Most of the families that took part were non-white. We only had 2 white families, and one of the pilots was a white family. And it really shows also, it was a fairly accurate depiction of the diversity of Leicester, I would say. We had shopping voucher incentives because we wanted to make sure that we were actually paying people for their time. Because we just thought that was an important thing to do. And they actually weren't covered by the European Research Grant, which is actually really frustrating. I had to get separate funding from that, but we managed to do that, so that was good. And as you can see in our lovely little diagram here, we had 100% satisfaction with the workshop. They actually didn't. The most interesting thing, I think, if you have a look at this set of feedback, the most interesting one was having this workshop physically would have led to better outcomes, and most of that was either neutral or some sort of disagree. There were a few people who had agreed with the statement, but on the most part, they actually really enjoyed the fact that it was online. And one of the biggest, I think the thing that really hit me the most was one of these families, basically, the father, who was the main breadwinner for the family, in the follow-up interview, he basically was just so happy to have been involved, because normally he wouldn't get involved with things with the children because he's off working all day. And instead he said they were able to sit around the dinner table and they could discuss the problem that we gave them, and then they do the artwork after dinner, and he could be involved as well. Because most of these sorts of workshops are on during work hours, they're on during the week when, academics are at work, or, things like that, right? So they're not usually on, in the evenings, and if they're on in the evenings, it's usually at dinner time when you're putting the kids to bed or something like that. Or if they're on the weekends, there might be other things that parents need to do on the weekends, like, look after other family or take kids to sport or whatever it is, right? So some of these families were just so happy to be able to actually participate, because they wouldn't normally have been able to do it. So we were very pleased with the outcomes of this workshop. So here are some of the outputs that we had. So this is some of the series of the problems that we had. So on the top left-hand side, we have mess, and there's another one of mess on the bottom right-hand side, just above my head here. But we had some other interesting things, a lot of lockdown-related problems. So the bottom left-hand corner is about mental health and lockdown, and how the lockdown had been affecting this child's mental health. So all of these were, the brief generally was, find a problem in your home and draw it that you think technology might be able to help with, and draw it. So obviously the big one down the bottom, Lockdown 2020, this was a series by a couple of kids who they didn't have a garden and they just have the park across the road, but they were only allowed to go out, I think you were only allowed to go out once for an hour or something for exercise at that point. And so they could see the park from their window and the school was closed, and they were starting to really miss their friends and family actually going to school. And then there's the one up the top in the middle, we have it's about communication, and the fact that one of these children, this child was having trouble understanding, because his English wasn't great. He was having trouble understanding a lot of these online kind of educational pieces of software and things like that. And then on the top right, we have a more classic problem of ants. So one of the series of solutions. So for the mess app, the mess problems, we had a couple of different approaches. Up the top, we had another family designed an app that would detect whether, you take a photograph of before and a photograph after, and it would detect how much mess had been cleaned up. But for the kid who was worried about mental health, this whole virtual reality system was developed. So we have virtual health, virtual holidays, virtual reality home, virtual parks and gardens, and the hope there was to help, that this technology might be able to help to mitigate some of these issues that this child was having. This one on the right I particularly like because it was very engineering. And this is the one where the father got involved, and he was really excited because I think he must have been some sort of engineer. But he got apparently the children did actually have input into this. This is about bottle recycling, like what happens when your water bottle is empty. And it was a very young child that came up with the problem. It was about empty water bottles. What do you do with them? And so this guy and his family developed this quite impressive prototype of a bottle recycler. Now down the bottom left we have the translation. This was the most beautiful idea, was a butterfly translator that would sit on your ear and would flap about in front of the screen and would translate the words for you. I thought that was just gorgeous. And of course here we've got an ant detector app that then it will then release this spray that will kill the ants, which, a little bit sad, I guess. And then another mess related one, which is about a space hoover that would go around and suck up all the toys. It's children, so a little bit fantastical, right? So those solutions were then sent back to the original families, and then they were invited to modify or change the or create some sort of alternative if they didn't think it was such a great idea. So up the top we have the cleaning app turned into an app that has points and things associated with it, and you earn rewards depending on how great your before and after pictures were. We've got, as you can see, the original family modified slightly the bottle recycler to add straws and lids capabilities. And the butterfly down the bottom, we have a small butterfly for children and a big butterfly for adults, which I just think is just adorable. And we've got then this space hoover turned into this really impressive UFO looking thing in the middle, which I think is probably based off a Roomba or something. But not only does it suck up all the toys, but it then actually, there are chips in all the toys that tell it where to put all the toys into boxes. So that's all the categories above. And then this, the bottom, the virtual reality kind of mental health thing turned into this thing that works with the television, and there's a watch, and it got very, these families got really involved in developing these, and they really seem to enjoy thinking about them. So here's an example of how it went. So this is the family that was bored under lockdown. There was a Boredom Buster app that was created, and then the Boredom Buster got put into the robot. So it was. This is just a like. I love that it says help up the top here on the first picture. And it says, "Mummy, I'm bored," and Mummy says, "I'm busy," and then another child says, "I hate lockdown. This TV program is boring." And so yeah, so this really illustrates where we were at with the beginning of lockdown. So anyway, so that's kind of how it went. So now that we've got this output, we're actually going to do a series of next steps where I want to take these artworks and actually give them to product designers to look at. So I'm involved a lot in the Hackspace community over here in the UK. Anyway, but I'm going to basically interview a bunch of my friends who happen to be things like product designers, cutting edge innovators, rapid manufacturing experts, that sort of thing, about the technologies that our participants came up with and their feasibility. So we want to look to see if these hackers think about the social and ethical impacts of these potential technologies, because some of them are a little bit creepy. So this one on the right here is an example from actually our pilot where the Fiki, the girl in the wheelchair, isn't able to speak, and Alexa has some sort of ability to read her mind and translate her cries into actual what Fiki is after. So while that sounds like a nice way of communicating with someone with communication problems, the idea of Alexa reading my mind is perhaps ethically problematic. So I want to see if these hackers come up with any of these issues, if they looked at that kind of, these sorts of ethical and social potential impacts, if they do that kind of anticipation of problematic parts of the technologies, or if they just kind of think, oh yeah, that would be really cool, I could probably write that tomorrow, which, we'll see what happens there. We're also going to be developing within the whole project across Europe these innovation labs. So we're presenting some of the problems that our families came up with, and seeing what these big companies think and about solving how to solve these problems. And I think when it comes to looking at what the technologies of 2030 are going to be like, they're not as fantastical as perhaps you might think. For a lot of people, it's just going to be about accessibility to technology. So the fact that you can buy a Roomba is great, but they're really expensive. So maybe how do you make a Roomba, or even something as simple as a Roomba? How do you make that cheap so that everybody can have access to it in 2030? This is one of the reasons why I think it was so important to involve these people, but also to show that these big companies, that's not necessarily about innovating new technologies, it's about making current technologies cheaper and more accessible and more sustainable and recyclable and last longer and all of this sort of stuff as well. So I think the take-home messages that I want to leave you with today is that really it's about that technology needs these diverse voices to present problems, co-create solutions, and show what their needs are, because like I said before, these sorts of needs are fairly simple sometimes. They might just be things like getting rid of ants in the house, or they might be things like that technologies that already exist but are just inaccessible to these families. Ethical approaches such as responsible research and innovation advocate engaging with all stakeholders, but in reality it's quite hard to do this with traditional methods because it's hard to get people involved. Most of these families, they said they would never be able to come into the city, for example, even though it's a half-hour bus ride away, perhaps, possibly because they couldn't afford to even get a bus ticket. And things like the classic research project approach of offering lunch, and like a full day workshop that offers lunch is just not appropriate for engaging with anyone other than people that can afford to actually take the time to do that, right? So we need alternative methods to traditional focus groups, so that we can elicit the thoughts, feelings, concerns, and hopes for the future from non-traditional stakeholders. And and basically working with these low-income families and traditional workshops would mostly only engage non-working mothers with children. And working asynchronously online allowed for all kinds of families to get involved with discussions over the dinner table, in the car, on walks, and with other members of the family that might not usually get involved. For example, working members of the family. I'm really just like, this is my main kind of drive now is how do we translate these kind of philosophical approaches to computer ethics into actual concrete reality for people that actually have to live it. So if you're interested in more information about the particular project that we did in Leicester, we have a website where you can see all of the artworks. You can watch a pretty little video of them all, and it's all very nice. That's liveinleicester.net. Project Living Innovation is at living-innovation.net. So me, I'm Catherine Flick on Twitter. You're welcome to follow me. I post a lot about tech ethics. And I have a website which is very out of date, so apologies, but it's got some of the basics there. And if you are interested in my centre, which is one of the oldest and largest centres for technology ethics in Europe, the Centre for Computing and Social Responsibility. Yeah, thanks again very much for having me. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. If you have any questions, I assume there'll be some way for me to interact with you and answer them. But you're more than welcome to hit me up on Twitter or email me or contact me in any other way. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.